Hey everyone, in this video, I'm going to show you how to set up Azure Functions using the Python V2 model locally. So first, kind of what are Azure Functions and what problem does it solve? So essentially, Azure Functions allow you to run your Python scripts and functions in Azure without having to create the infrastructure first. So what are some other examples, right? Let's say you want to use Databricks, where you have to actually create a Databricks resource and then create a cluster, configure the cluster, create a notebook, add your code, and then run your scripts, right? You have to set up all that. Or like a virtual machine, you have to actually create a virtual machine in the cloud and then install Python and then run your code. This here is just saying, look, I have some Python scripts and stuff I want to run in Azure. Azure says, all right, I'm going to take care of the infrastructure for you. Just tell me what you want to run and I'll run it for you. So it's pretty cool and it's pretty simple. Now, some important concepts as well to know are triggers, input bindings, and output bindings. Triggers are essentially just when do you want your code to run, right? Do you want it to run once a day, like your Python script, right? Or once a week, or like an event base. Like for example, if you add a new file to a storage account, then do you want to kick off your function? You can also have input bindings. That's where you actually want to bind to a particular object. So for example, if you have a storage account and you want to actually grab a file, so like a new file gets uploaded, you want to grab that new file and do some transformations or something with, you can bind to that. Then output bindings are, in my function, I did something with data, right? I added some new like rows or whatever I wanted to do, and I wanted to output this somewhere, like output it to a storage account file. You can bind to that storage account and add that file in that storage account to that storage account. So in this video, I'm going to show you the local setup and then the file structure and everything that gets created so get comfortable using Azure Functions. And then I'll show you some examples. So I'll actually go some HTTP triggers. I'll show you some storage triggers and functions. And we'll actually use the local storage Azure Write, which I'll show you how to set up to run it. That means we don't have to create a storage account in the cloud. We can actually do it all locally from our local setting here, all for free. And then I'll actually show you how to add functions to different files. This is useful if, instead of adding all of your functions, if you have like 50 functions to one file, you can actually split it up into multiple files and still package it up into one function app you can then deploy to the cloud. So I'll show you how to do that too. So let's get started. So the first thing you want to do as a prerequisite is you want to install this Azure Functions Core Tools. This allows you to kind of add the necessary packages and then use the command line and different things to run your function app and functions locally. And I'll link this in the description below. So you click on Python here, click on which operating system you want, Windows or Linux, whatever you have, and then install it. Then once you install it, let's actually get started. So I'm in Visual Studio Code here, and you can use any IDE that you want to. Use any IDE that you want to, but I'm going to use Visual Studio Code here kind of for simple sake here. Then I'm going to create a new terminal. And I did that by going to terminals here, a new terminal. And then what I'm going to do is you can actually start and now you have it. Okay. I actually do func here. And you can actually see all the different commands and everything you can do from the command line. So what I'm going to do is let's first create an actual function project. And then I'll show you what we're going to do. So to do that, what you can do is in the command line, you can type in this func, and then this init. This is going to initialize a new function project for us. And we can call this whatever you want to. I'm going to call it my function project. And this hyphen hyphen and this Python. Same, we use the Python version. And then the module is going to be the V2 module. So then if you run this, it's actually going to create a bunch of folders and files for us. All right, that we can see right here. Now, what does this all do? We're actually going to go through this in just a second here. Now, the first thing you want to do is you want to cd into your actual project. So you want to do cd, change directory, my function project. Okay, and you want to do this ls or list to make sure you can actually see those files there. All right, and then the first thing you want to do is actually want to create a virtual environment. So to do so, you can type in Python, or if you have a newer version, just py, and then this module, and then the venv, the virtual environment module, .venv is what we can call this anything. So .venv is what we're going to call it. This is going to create a virtual environment, kind of initialize it for us. Now this is really important because it isolates our code from other projects that we're doing, right? So it doesn't conflict with different versions. You can isolate your code and deploy it all as one piece. So it's a lot easier to do. And always, whenever you create new projects in Python, always use virtual environments. Okay, now that was created, to activate it, what you do is you can do this dot. That just means start in whatever current directory we're in. So this my function project and the slash, and then we're going to go into the .venv folder /scripts activate.ps1. Okay, that activated it for us. And if you're wondering where I got this from, it's in this .venv folder. You see this scripts folder and this activate here to activate it, and it shows up in green here. So now if we do pip list, you'll see that we just have pip and setup tools installed here. So now let's actually go over a couple of files and what actually is listed here. So the first one, again, I showed you is that .venv, our virtual environment that just got created. And now this .vs code folder was created. You see this extension is .json. So in Visual Studio Code, there's actually an extension for Azure Functions you can use to kind of, use the GUI more, right? The graphical user interface to kind of select, create a function, or do whatever you want to do. I'm going to show you how to do it via the command line, because if you don't have Visual Studio Code, you can still use it in your IDE of choice, your interactive development environment, or I just like it a little bit more than the GUI there, but feel free to use that if you want to. Then it created a .getignore file. This is for our source code, right? Or we're sending our code up to GitHub and our using Git and everything. It's going to tell us what files to ignore, because we don't want to send everything. We want to ignore some files. We can do that. And so if you see here, it's already going to ignore our .venv Python environment. So it's going to actually ignore this file if we were to send this up, which we want. We don't want to show this in GitHub or anything like that. So the next piece is our actual function app. This is actually, we're going to actually install and run our code and everything there. So I'm going to show you what this looks like and actually go through this a little bit later. The next piece is this host.json. This is going to apply to all of our functions. Okay, now this is more when you deploy to the cloud. This is going to be the application insights, which is an Azure application insights kind of resource to kind of help log resources. And this is the 2.0 schema version of the host.json file. Because we're doing this all locally, we don't need to really worry about this piece. But in my next video, I'll show you how to deploy this. I will actually go into more of what you can configure with this. And this is actually the bundle and extensions bundle that we're going to use. So this version of this extension bundle. Okay, now we have this local.settings JSON. This is really important locally. This is where we add our key values that we want to use. So if you actually are going to connect to an actual Azure storage account in the cloud, you can add a connection string here, right? So you can test it there. We're actually going to use it and test ours locally. So a couple of values here are this functions worker runtime. That means we're using the Python version. And this Azure Web Jobs feature flag means we're actually going to use the Python V2 model of it. Then this Azure Web Jobs storage key is actually going to say use development storage is true. So it actually allows us to use Azure Write, which is our local storage emulator. So we don't actually have to create a storage account in the cloud. So any storage account triggers we want to use, we actually test it all locally, which I'll show you how to do. Now this encrypted value is set to false by default, meaning that these values are not encrypted. Now one thing you can do is you can actually add a kind of setting, and I'll show you what this encrypted thing does, right? So if I do settings, add, I can add a key value pair. So this is called my new con for like connection, and just add it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if we add that, it can add that here. Now you can also add key value pairs manually, right? There's nothing wrong with that, right? So you can add like, whatever you want to there, but I'm just going to do it here. And you see how this is unencrypted, the value that we did? Now, if I were to remove this, okay, and I were to change this to true, then if I do the same thing, then if you see, it's actually going to encrypt this value. This is useful if you're at like a public location, like a coffee shop, right? And you don't want people looking over your screen and seeing your actual key, access values and everything, or your secret values. So that's why you can do that. But again, you don't really need to do this for this example. I just want to show you what that looked like. So I'm going to turn this back to false because we're at home and it's, it's okay. Okay, so now the last piece is this requirements.txt file. This is actually going to install all of our Python packages that we want. So it's going to install this Azure Functions Python package for us. You can add other ones, like if you want to use pandas or if you want to use like NumPy or whatever you want to, you can add those there as well. And then to install this in your command line, you can do pip install, and you can use R for this requirements flag, requirements.txt. And then it's actually going to install all of the packages that are listed here. So install that Azure Functions for us. So now if we go and we do pip list, you'll see that we have our Azure Functions now set up here. All right, so now it's all being said, let's actually create some functions. So let's go back to this function app. Now, if you see here, I'm not in my virtual environment. in this interpreter here. This is still my global interpreter. So if this ever happens to you, what you want to do is then go into your VNV, folder, and then go into your scripts and go into this python.exe and then copy this path and then click here in the right, go to add interpreter path. Now it's going to show up here. I'm going to add this interpreter path and then click here and then go. And now it's going to show up as this virtual environment. All right. Now that that's set up, let's actually create some functions. So it's going to already import this func, right? This part of the package here, which is the module. And it said daytime, JSON, and logging, just some helpful packages for you, modules to use. And it's going to instantiate this app variable. Now this app variable is actually a function app, right? So it's actually this class that's going to host and contain all of our functions. So you can have one or more functions contained in this function app. So the way to do this is let's actually create our first function. We're going to create an HTTP function. So the way to do that is here. So let me show you what this looks like. Now, how this works is in the Python V2, the newer model, you actually use decorators. That's what this app symbol means. This is a decorator. So this is essentially saying this is a function app, right? We want to decorate this function app. So it's like you want to add bows to it. If you're thinking like a GIF package, right, or another sticker, right? You want to decorate this. Or say you actually want to add a function name to this function app, this container. And we're going to say our first function is called this first function, first HTTP function. Now, to set up an HTTP function, we want to also add a route. So we're going to use another decorator and say this route. And we can call this is the endpoint of our HTTP request call, right? Is this going to be this my route? And this auth level just means we're going to use the anonymous auth level, so no API key is required to run this function. When we actually push the code to the cloud, I'll show you the other auth levels you can configure. But again, this is an optional one. You don't need to specify. I just want to show you what that is here. Then we created a function called test function. You can create this, whatever function name you want. And then we're going to use this request req parameter. Okay, and this is actually going to be our func.http request. So we're going to actually give this function a HTTP request, and it's going to return an HTTP response. All right, and now we're going to log just saying that this function processed a request, and then we're actually going to return, right, this return piece a HTTP response saying, wow, this HTTP function actually worked. And return a status code of 200 saying this worked. Then actually run your function app. You can do func start. And now when we run this, it's going to go into this function app file. It's going to check. It's going to find we have our function here. It's going to display it down here for us. Okay. Now this customer packages not in syspath. This is actually because of a newer version here that they have. This is because we're actually testing locally here. You don't need to worry about this. When you're actually in the cloud and run this, it's not going to come up. Again, it's just because we're testing locally here. So now you see here, it found our function. And it found this first HTTP function, which is this name we gave it here. All right, now you can actually hover over this, hold the control key, and then left click. And then in a new browser, it's going to run our HTTP function. If you see here, my route is that endpoint name that we gave it. So it's going to run that. It's going to say, wow, this first HTTP function works. That's great. So our function app, now we created our first function. Okay. Now to stop this, you hold control and then hit C. Right? And that actually stops our Azure function from running. Okay, now let me show you another kind of way that we do a little bit more with this HTTP function. Okay, so I'm going to create a second HTTP function. To do that, simply go to another line. Okay, now we're going to create a second HTTP function. So again, same thing. We're going to decorate it with this function name, add a new route, and we're going to call this new route. Right, just show you the difference here. Again, same thing. You can name this function whatever you want to. It doesn't really matter. Use the same requirement parameter, and then we're going to package in this, send an HTTP request, get a response. We're going to say start in the second HTTP function request. And now here, you can actually say, you can add in these parameters, right? These request parameters. This is what we can add to the end of our request and do some configuration things or whatever kind of you wanted to do. So I'm going to create this name variable here. It's going to say, I want you to get this name. And if that name exists, so I've added it to the end of our HTTP request, then print out, hello, that name that I gave it. So glad this function worked. Otherwise, if we didn't add that, just say, hello, so glad this function worked. And then return the response, right? Return the message and give us that status. So now we're going to do the func start again. And it's going to say we found two functions. All right, it's going to run the core tools again. And then it's going to say, here's our functions, here's our second HTTP function. So if I hover over this, left click, hold control and left click, it's going to say, if you see here, it's going to log for us here, executing it right, and then starting HTTP request, which is what we had listed up here. And then if you see here, because we didn't give it a name, it automatically said, hello, so glad this function worked. Now to give it a name, you can actually, at the end here, you can do the shift question mark, and I can say name equals, let's call it Sarah. I can say, wow, hello, Sarah, so glad this function worked. Or you can change it to Nick, right? Hello, Nick, right? And again, if you don't give it a name and we just go back here, it's going to give us that default value here. So that's kind of how you can configure some cool things you can do with different HTTP requests. So that kind of covers that piece. Now, and again, to stop it, hold Control and then C, and then we'll end that piece there. Okay, now we're actually going to do some storage triggers. So this is how we actually test locally. So the first thing you want to do is you want to install Azure. So Azure is our local storage account. Okay, this allows you to actually use a local development storage. You don't have to install one or create one in Azure. You can do this all locally. So I'll link this in the description below too. But essentially, you can just install this with like npm. There's a Visual Studio Code extension as well for Azure. I installed mine with npm, and then once you install this, right, what you can do is what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this terminal. Okay, so I'm going to have two terminals here. And this first one, I'm actually going to start Azure. And to start it, you can do Azure, and just hit enter. And then it's saying, you see the blob service is starting, the queue, the table. So now it's listening for our storage emulator. Okay. And now what you can do is you can use Microsoft Storage Explorer, right? And just to be able to install that, I'll link this in the description below. Here's the path where you actually would install Azure Storage Explorer, which is this application I'm using here. Okay, now we're actually in our emulator, right? So if you see here, it's using this dev storage account, right? This is kind of a default. It's listening on this loopback loop, which is this 127.0.0.1. And now what we can do is actually do a couple things. So what we want to do is we actually can create a new container here. So let's actually go here. Let's actually refresh here. So we go to our storage accounts, right? We can go to the emulator. Okay, now we go to our blob containers. And then what we can do is actually create a new blob container. So what I'll do is I'll call this new container. Okay, so now we have a new container here set up. Again, this is all locally. I don't have anything in Azure. This is all locally that I'm doing here. All right, and now what I'm going to do is we're going to paste in this storage account trigger, and I'll show you what actually is going to happen. So let's go down here. We're going to create another function. This is going to be our first blob function. So what we want to do is, again, we add another name here, and then we're going to add this blob trigger. This is going to create our blob function, our storage trigger, right, and storage function. And then this argument name is what we're going to give it. This is going to instantiate that kind of binding. If I remember those input bindings, it's going to instantiate that and contain our code into this my blob piece. Okay, and then this path is just going to say whenever that new container blob we just created right here, whenever a file called people.csv gets added to this container, I want you to run this function, right? So it's going to run this function when it detects that this new people.csv file has been added. And then if you see the connection that we use is that Azure Web Job Storage. I get this from our local settings here, right? This is the key value that's saying using the Azure right locally. That's where this is coming. This is an environment variable that we can use. So then I use that as my connection parameter, my connection argument. And then we create our function, test function. Again, this is the my blob. So if you had the different name here, you'd have to use that here. So this has to be the same value you'd use here. And then we're going to actually use this func.inputStream. This is actually going to bind our input binding and grab this people.csv file. Okay, is an input stream. Okay, and then all we're going to do is just in this function, we're just going to log and just say that it was, like this function triggered after this file was uploaded. So cool. And then it's actually going to print the name of the blob path. right? So now we can say this blob, my blob, again, that's instantiated this code dot name. It's going to print out the name of the blob for us. Okay, so now we're going to start our function here, and let's give it some more space. So I'm going to remove those, minimize those files there. Okay, and then it will detect our blob. See, this is a blob trigger, right? So saying, hey, this is actually a blob trigger that I found. And now what we're going to do is in here, I'm going to upload a file here called people.csv. And you can go and upload it here. I'm actually just going to drag and drop my folder, my file here. Okay, I'm just going to drag it right here. And now it's going to add this people.csv file. And then it's actually going to then trigger our actual function to run and print out that blob.name. So sometimes it just takes a second. And now if we go back, if you see here, it just ran. It said Python triggered after the was uploaded to the new container. So cool. Printing the name of the blob path, and then it printed that new container people.csv, which is right here. Right. So that's kind of cool. So we actually were able to do that. Now, let's say we actually want to do a little bit more. So let me show you another example of what you can do. So what we can do is we can actually create another function here, another blob storage function. Let's say we actually want to read this stuff in. So what you're going to do, and actually want to read in this file and do something with it. So here's how you can do that. Now, we have another function called read file blob function, and we're going to change the argument to read file. So again, that's why you have to put it here. And I have a different function name just so you can create different function names. Again, we're going to use a blob trigger saying that when a new file called people2.csv is uploaded, then run our function, run this function. And again, we're going to use the same Azure Write storage piece there. And then we're going to grab this file. And then if you see here, these are highlighted out. So we actually have to import these two modules, this CSV module and this codex. These are just packages in Python that allow you to read input stream files a little bit easier and make it a little bit better for you. So I'm actually going to add those up here. Now that we added those, it's actually going to then read this file, and it's actually going to print out every line in the file. There's only 2 lines, but it's going to print out those lines. So now we can do func start. And it's going to say, wow, you added another file, right? Another function here, right? This blob trigger, right? This read file. So now we go in here, and now I'm going to upload my people2.csv file. So I'm going to drag that over here, and it's going to kick off that function. Okay? All right. And now what it's going to do is then, if you see here, it actually read it. So it actually ran it, and then if you see, it printed out all of the lines. Now, you can do you can create data frames, you can do transformations. Again, I just want to show you what this looks like, and I just have it printed out the 3 lines here, right? So if we actually go to the file here, you can actually preview this, and you'll see that I just printed out, right, these 3 lines right in the code there. So yeah, just show you that it actually works. And so that's kind of how you run those functions. Now, the last piece is, what if you want to create functions in different files, right? Like we just added a bunch of functions here. What if we want to separate this into different files? How can you do that? And also, I'm going to stop Azure right here because we don't need that anymore. So that's how you do that, is you just do Control-C again, and then we can close that. And then we'll get out of this. Okay, and now for the last piece, how do we add additional functions? So we added a couple functions here already, right? Let's say we actually want to separate these or add a new function to a new file, right? So we can kind of separate our code. To do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file called additional functions.py. And then in here, what you want to do is you want to add our same setup that we had before, original file, right? Our function as func, and then logging. But in this file, what you want to do is actually create a blueprint. This is actually going to be a container of our code, right, of our functions. Okay, so I create this variable called BP, which is short for blueprint. Then I do this func.blueprint here. And again, this is another container just like the Azure function was, but it's used for if you have, if it's your functions run in a different file. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a function here. To do that, I'll add another HTTP function. But again, instead of using that app that we had in the previous file, we're going to use our BP, our blueprint container, to then decorate that. So we're going to add an additional function. Again, brand new route. We'll use this request, again, HTTP request, and we'll just print out hello, this worked, and return that. So now, if we go back to our function app, how do we then tell it that we have new functions, right? So what you do is you then go, and you have to then import it, right? So this additional functions is that file name here. We're going to import that BP. Again, that's that blueprint variable that we have here that contains one or more of our functions here. And again, you can create more down here if you wanted to. Okay, and then once we do that, the last piece is we have to register this new blueprint to our actual function container. So we're going to register those functions in here as well. To do that, once you do, you can actually go down here. You can do this app, again, another decorator, right? Not a decorator here, but it's this this method here that register blueprint, and then we're going to add our BP, right? This, again, container here. Then once we add that, and then we run this, and actually because we're not using Azure right, I'm actually going to comment out our storage triggers, right? Because it won't be able to pick up these storage triggers because Azure right isn't running. So I'm just going to comment those out. So then we'll just see our HTTP functions. Okay. Now if we actually start this, whoops. So you have to go. Remember, make sure you always go back into your root. And you see, yep, these here. Okay. Now func start. Okay. And now it's actually going to register and then pick up this additional functions, this additional function HTTP along with our other functions. Again, I commented out those storage functions. And if you see here, it picked up that additional HTTP function, just like we wanted to with that brand new route. So if we run this, right, it shows, hello, this worked. Perfect. And again, we have our other functions as well. So that's how you do that. Yeah, that's really what I want to show you today. The last thing is I have this, if you're ever curious about the code I just wrote in this, I have a GitHub repository called Data Engineering with Nick, this Azure Functions repo, and then I have all the code listed here. So feel free to add this, clone this, or do whatever you want to do for it. So yeah, thanks for your time today, and I hope this was helpful. In the next video, I will show you how to actually deploy this to the cloud and then configure your settings and actually use it from the cloud. So thanks so much.